In Cambodia, the killing fields where enemies of the Khmer Rouge regime can still be visited. There you will find the bones and artifacts that belong to the 2 million people slaughtered by Pol Pot. From 1975 to 1979, Cambodia experienced one of the worst genocides in human history.
The beginnings of the Khmer Rouge began in the absence of the current leader, Prince Sihanouk, who was in Europe. Lon Nol, a military general, staged a coup supported by the United States, who at this point in time were involved in the Vietnam War. The United States chose to help to topple Prince Sihanouk's regime because they wanted access to Viet Cong sanctuaries and strongholds in Cambodia. Extensive bombing of the area had already been taking place. Most rurally populated areas were destroyed, resulting in a huge influx of immigrants to central cities such as Phnom Penh, which grew from 600,000 people to 3 million people in a span of 3 years. The Lon Nol regime collapsed, and amid the chaos of bombing, the influx of rapid urbanization, and tensions present from a previously weak economy, the Khmer Rouge rose from the dust cloud. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces, led by Pol Pot, captured Phnom Penh and began their dramatic revolutionary experiment, perhaps the most dramatic form of social engineering ever attempted in human history. Pol Pot wanted Cambodia to become an agrarian utopia. He was willing to go to any extent to achieve this goal. In order for a society to be fully effective, he needed to eradicate millions of intellectuals, religious minorities, and homosexuals. The largest toll fell on doctors, teachers, lawyers, and other well-educated members of Cambodian society. A Khmer Rouge motto displayed their cruelty. The motto was, "To spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss."
After the rise of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, they began to implement policies that most would consider invasive. They began by destroying the banks and turning Cambodia into a huge farm, because they believed that equality would be attained by the sacrifice of individual rights. Then, they began forcibly moving the populations to begin work on the farm. They did not differentiate between who went to work. It was either work or death. No one was exempt, even those that were sick or dying. In order to coerce people into working, they would use torture centers and mass executions. While people were working, the most common cause of death would be by malnutrition and disease, and a total of around 25% of the population, which is about 2 million people, were killed. While all of these horrors were happening in Cambodia, very little attention was paid to the events. In fact, there were only errant observations made. As these events began to gain traction and attention on a global scale, people began to realize the horrors of the Khmer Rouge regime and began speaking out. Kenneth M. Quinn, the United States' ambassador to Cambodia at the time, was quoted saying, "The Khmer Rouge regime has much in common with those of totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union." He continued by saying, "What emerges as the explanation for the terror and violence that swept Cambodia during the 1970s is that a small group of alienated intellectuals, enraged by their perception of a totally corrupt society, and imbued with a Maoist plan to create a pure socialist order in the shortest possible time, recruited extremely young, poor, and envious cadres, instructed them in harsh and brutal methods learned from Stalinist mentors, and used them to destroy physically the cultural underpinnings of the Khmer civilization, and to impose a new society through purges, executions, and violence." The genocide ended when the Vietnamese invaded in 1979 and toppled Pol Pot. The oppression and suffering ceased for the Cambodian people, and the process of rebuilding began. In the past 4 decades, there have been tribunals regarding the perpetrators of the genocides. They have been widely criticized for the ineffectuality, only convicting one of Pol Pot's lieutenants out of many Khmer military personnel for crimes against humanity. Incredibly, Pol Pot was never convicted because he fled to communist China seeking asylum after the Vietnamese invaded.
The Cambodian genocide was the most widespread and destructive social experiment of the 20th century. Millions of lives were lost under the cruelest of conditions for the so-called benefit of the state. Pol Pot's demented agrarian utopia was more like a death camp than a functioning society. Regarding the prevention of another atrocity, such as the Cambodian genocide, would require international supervision in order to prevent the great instability that allowed the Khmer Rouge to rise to power. If stability is maintained, innocent lives can and will be saved.